Okay, it's past 5. I suppose we can start as I suggested. So more officially than a couple of minutes ago, welcome to everyone, and welcome to this new session of the Milan seminar, The History of Modern Moral Philosophy, uh, uh, which many of you already know attended in previous instances. Uh, Today we have our first Kant talk, or at least in partially a Kant talk, if I may say so. And I mean, we are lucky enough to have for that occasion Paul Geyer as our guest today. Often one says our guest needs no introduction, and this is especially the case, I would say, in this particular occasion. Paul certainly doesn't need that I introduce you to this audience. Is, of course, as you know, now emeritus professor at Milan University, and most importantly, is just one uniquely important figure in the history of Kant scholarship because of his innumerable contributions to virtually every area and aspect of Kant's philosophy. And that is not even all that he has done, as you know, since he has also published I should say, in the meantime, a monumental 3-volume history of aesthetics, which is something like a parallel work to T.H. Irwin's history of ethics, if only focused on a narrower period of time, I mean, the period of time in which aesthetics was developed. And well, I would just like to mention his last, as far as I know, if I didn't, if no new volumes skipped my eyes, his last book that was in 2024, Kant's Impact on Moral Philosophy, and very substantial and impressive, even by Paul's standards, work on, well, the many ways in which Kant's moral philosophy has had an impact on the following moral philosophy in general. So we are just especially happy to have you here today, Paul. We are very glad that you could accept our invitation. The topic that Paul has proposed for his talk today is a supposed right to lie, Kant and Hutcheson. I just, before I leave Paul the floor, I have to say I hear lots of interferences in my audio, but it might be me. I mean, as long as you are not disturbed by anything, and Paul especially is not disturbed by interferences, I will leave Paul the floor. And thanks again for being here today. Thanks, Paul.
I thought, Stefano, that you were going to say, as long as Paul does not disturb anyone. But thank you so much for that very kind non-introduction. I'm very glad to be here, and I think I haven't missed any of these so far. It's been a wonderful series and a great thing that you guys are doing. Just a very quick word about this paper. When Stefano invited me to give a talk, I didn't have a particular topic in mind yet. And this paper was not on my agenda of things to be writing in the near future. It's inspired partly by Ryan Hanley's fabulous talk about Hutcheson 2 sessions back, and by the publication, finally, of Liberty Fund's edition of the System of Moral, Hutcheson's System of Moral Philosophy, which I tore through all 600 something pages of it as soon as it came into my hands. And fantastic work. And Stefano was just telling me that in June, this series will have sort of launch for that book. And so this is a little Vorspeise, perhaps, for that. I was in going over the paper again earlier this week. I wanted a reference for something I said about Henry Sidgwick. So I was leafing through Methods of Ethics to find a suitable page number, and I came across this sentence, which I've decided to put on the paper as a sort of epigraph. So this is from Sidgwick's Method of Ethics. He says, not only is the general utility of truth speaking so manifest as to need no proof, but wherever this utility seems to be absent or outweighed by particular bad consequences, we find that common sense at least hesitates to enforce that rule. That kind of sums up in a nutshell what Hutcheson's position is. And my question is, to what extent Kant could, on his own premises, rightly take account of that bit of common sense. Okay, so now paper itself, and I'll try not to ad lib too much, so I get through the paper and leave time for discussion. The first section is entitled "A Right to Lie and Rights of Necessity." In the famous 1797 Über ein vermeintes Recht aus Menschenleben zu lügen, which Mary Gregor translated as a supposed right to lie from philanthropy, which seemed to me a bit of to show a bit of a tin ear in translating Menschenliebe as philanthropy because of this very specific connotation of that in English. And I think it's better translated by Jens Timmerman as from love of humanity, and I think it would be even better to translate it as from love of humans or love of human beings. At any rate, Kant argued against such a right, the supposed right, again, denying that we ever have moral permission to lie, even in the attempt to save an innocent victim from a murderer at our door. A striking feature of Kant's argumentation in that essay, which is directed against the French philosopher Benjamin Constant, who, according to Jens, may or may not have had Kant in mind in arguing behalf of the supposed right. A striking feature is that Kant did not connect his argument to a more general objection against the idea of any right of necessity, nor in his argument against any such right in the Doctrine of Right in the Metaphysics of Morals, which was published in the same year as the essay, had he mentioned a right to lie in order to save a life as an example of a supposed right of necessity. There, his example was only the famous plank of Carneades, that is, the question whether it would be permissible for one victim of a shipwreck to push another who was already holding on to a plank sufficient to support only one person off of that plank in order to save his own life, a case that is discussed by Cicero in De Officiis and in the 4th century CE by Lactantius in his Divine Institutes. Kant's response to that example is that condemning another to certain death by drowning in order to save oneself from that fate is morally, objectively wrong, quote, in terms of what a law prescribes. Thus, he says, the deed of saving one's life is not to be judged inculpable, but only unpunishable, subjectively, he says, because the possibility of a threatened punishment cannot outweigh the necessary or the inevitable fate of drowning if one does not push the other off the plank. So no threatened punishment could be an effective deterrent of such an act. He says, a threat of an ill that is still uncertain, namely death by a judicial verdict, cannot outweigh the fear of an ill that is certain, namely drowning. And so, continuing to quote, a penal law of this sort, that is death or any other punishment for pushing the other off the plank, could not have the effect intended. This argument, by the way, shows that at least in this passage, Kant is assuming a purely deterrent justification of punishment. which is also, I think, what is implied by his fundamental justification of the threat or use of coercion as a hindrance to the hindrance of freedom, even if later in the doctrine of right, he argues that the lex talionis, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, is only the determinate measure for the severity of any punishment, although he also seems to allow for a retributive justification of punishment when he argues that even a society in dissolution must execute its remaining murderers, quote, for otherwise the people can be regarded as collaborators in this public violation of justice, unquote. However, in spite of that little digression, Kant's views about punishment are not primarily my concern here. Rather, I'm struck by the fact that although Kant did not connect his rejection of a right to lie in order to save even an innocent life in the Essay on Constant to his rejection of an objective right of necessity in the doctrine of right, other authors in the natural law tradition, of which I regard Kant as an innovative member, did recognize and defend a variety of cases of a right to necessity. That is, a right to violate what would otherwise be a strict prohibition in order to avoid one's own death or the death of others. So, for example, in his early work, 2 books of the elements of universal jurisprudence from 1660, Pufendorf argued that, quote, the law about preserving oneself without disturbance to society or hurt to another person may be restricted through the case of necessity, unquote. And he said that this applies to the case of attempting to save another person as well. He says, on this point, we here lay down the principle that on the basis of the law of humanity, anyone whatsoever is bound, as not merely permitted, but bound, when not under an equal necessity, to the extent of his power, to come to the aid of a second person placed in an extreme necessity, unquote. Johann Gottlieb Heinekius wrote that although, quote, the common maxim that necessity has no law, or as he put it, quoting Euripides in the Hippolytus, in cases of imminent danger, even law ought to give way to necessity. Heinekius wrote, this is not universally true. Nevertheless, in at least some cases, absolute necessity, when an impendent evil cannot be avoided by any means, but by violating a law, deserves favor, as long as one had no hand in bringing himself into the strait, that is, as long as one is not in danger because of one's own prior wrongdoing. But the treatment of the right of necessity on which I will concentrate is that by Francis Hutcheson in his monumental system of moral philosophy. For Hutcheson explicitly defends such a right in a number of cases, including one very close to Kant's case of the murderer at the door, and the clearly consequentialist character of Hutcheson's defense seems to provide a clear contrast to, indeed, perhaps a clear target for Kant's presumably non-consequentialist basis for rejecting the objective validity of any such right. The philosophical payoff of a contrast between Hutcheson and Kant on the supposed right of necessity will in fact be to question whether Kant's position is or needs to be as non-consequentialist as we ordinarily assume, and indeed as he suggests in his response to Constant, if indeed that is to be taken as a rejection of a case of a right to necessity. I think that it should be, and that the ultimate foundation of Kant's moral philosophy in general does leave room for an acceptance of a right to necessity in extreme cases as more than just a, quote, subjective accident of penal law. Indeed, the point is already suggested by Pufendorf's suggestion a century earlier that the right of necessity is grounded in the law of humanity. For, at least in my view, the true foundation of Kant's moral philosophy, what he calls the ground of the possibility of a categorical imperative, is the premise that humanity is the ultimate end in itself. So my question will thus be whether on this basis, Kant should have allowed for a right to necessity in certain cases rather than rejecting it. So now for Hutcheson on the right to necessity. Hutcheson's monumental system of moral philosophy was posthumously published by his son, also called Francis, in 1755, almost a decade after Hutcheson's death in 1746. The work had apparently been largely completed by 1737 on the basis of the lectures on moral philosophy that Hutcheson gave following his appointment to the chair in moral philosophy in Glasgow in 1730. Work was certainly influenced by Pufendorf's widely read textbook, The Whole Duty of Man According to the Law of Nature, especially in the edition with commentary by Hutcheson's own teacher at Glasgow, Gershom Carmichael. I should interject here that none of this work would be possible without the incredible Natural Law and Enlightenment series of the Liberty Fund and Knut Håkanson's editorship of that. Hutcheson's system was immediately translated into German by none other than the 27-year-old Gotthold Ephraim Lessing, as under the name of Sittenlehre der Vernunft. Arthur Varda's reconstructed list of the contents of Kant's library at the time of his death in 1804 does not include a copy of the Sittenlehre der Vernunft, only copies of the German translations of Hutcheson's earlier works, the Inquiry into the Original of Our Ideas of Beauty and Virtue of 1725, and the Essay on the Nature and Conduct of the Passions with illustrations on the Moral Sense of 1728. But Varda's list, it's actually conjectural, it's based on the sale catalog of the guy who to whom Kant had willed his remaining books, Gensichin, who died a few years later. Varda's list represents only, at the best, what Kant happened to have on hand in 1804 at the time of his death. And we know that throughout his life, he read many books that are not on that list. We also know that Kant was intensively engaged with the work of Hutcheson in the early and middle 1760s. And I think it would be very surprising if Kant had not read the Sittenlehre der Vernunft at that time and remembered it well for the rest of his life. But even if Hutcheson's defense of the right of necessity in certain cases in that work is not the or a direct target of Kant's rejection of such a right in the doctrine of right, Hutcheson's treatment provides a useful contrast to Kant. Now, like many other natural law moralists, Hutcheson finds the normative foundation of morality and its coercively enforceable part, what Kant calls Recht, in God's benevolent constitution of our nature, including the power to understand our nature and its implications for our conduct without the need for revelation. As Hutcheson wraps up the system, quote, "We must discern the wonderful footsteps of divine wisdom in the constitution of our species, since it is by following the very principles of our nature, the affections and feelings of our heart, in that regular subordination of the more limited to the more extensive, which our inward moral sentiments recommend, and by the delightful exercise of the powers of reason which we are naturally prone to, that we obtain and secure to ourselves the noblest internal enjoyments and the greatest external advantages and pleasures which the unstable condition of terrestrial affairs will admit." That's from the conclusion of this system. I will ad-lib here that if you think that our nature is constituted divinely with benevolent intentions, you have no problem about going from is to ought. I don't think any 18th century philosopher had a problem about going from is to ought. The quote, the usually misunderstood quotation from Hume notwithstanding. In any case, our inward moral sentiments that Hutcheson refers to here are the same, I think, as the moral sense of his earlier works, which moral sense approves of benevolent intentions aiming at the greatest good for the greatest number. On Hutcheson's account, it is benevolent intentions of which we approve, since even with the best of intentions and the greatest care, the actual outcomes of our actions are not always what we intend. Hutcheson's view is that we naturally take pleasure in and therefore take an interest in the well-being of others, although at the same time we have a natural interest in our own well-being. Our nature or constitution, as divinely constituted, contains, he says, both a calm determination toward our own happiness, as well as many particular affections terminating upon the good of others. This is language from the System of Moral Philosophy. Of course, in many cases, our own good will be a proper part of the good of all, and indeed, sometimes we can best promote the good of all by promoting our own. But in case of conflict between the demands of our own good and that of the larger public, our inward moral sentiments, as endowed by God, will approve of promoting the latter rather than the former. He says, God, the author of our nature, plainly intended the universal happiness and that of each individual as far as it is consistent with it, and this intention should be our rule. We should therefore restrain and control not only all selfish affections, but even all generous affections within such bounds as the universal interest requires, unquote. This is, to be sure, the philosopher's abstract description of the object of God's and our approbation. In practice, Hutcheson says, it seems to me anticipating Sidgwick's famous point by more than a century, that's what I was looking for, quote, the notion of one's own highest happiness or the greatest aggregate or sum of valuable enjoyments is not generally formed by men. It is not expressly desired or intended. And he continues, in like manner, we have calm, benevolent affections towards individuals or smaller societies of our fellows, where there has not preceded any consideration of the most extensive system, and where they are not considered formally as part of this largest system, nor is their happiness pursued as conducing to the greatest sum of universal happiness, unquote. But in seeking to satisfy our own particular desires, but only so far as is consistent with and included in the satisfaction of the particular desires of particular others, we are in fact seeking to contribute to the greatest sum of universal happiness in the only way that we can. And the philosopher can describe our intentions in this way, that is, in a way that is not, so to speak, expressly present to the individual agent. And in what does, next question, in what does individual happiness and therefore the happiness of all consist in? In our, quote, noblest internal enjoyments and external advantages. That is, the perfection of our own capacities, above all our cognitive and rational capacities, and the possibility of using external objects, including the assistance of each other, to best realize the former. The preservation of life is, of course, a precondition of the enjoyment of our internal capacities and external advantages. And so the public good, as Hutcheson often calls it, consists of the preservation of life, the perfection of our natural capacities, and access to the external advantages or objects needed to support the first two, all of them distributed throughout the human population. A, quote, constant study to promote the most universal happiness in our power by doing all good offices as we have opportunity, which interfere with no more extensive interest of the system, preferring always the more extensive and important offices to those of less extent and importance, and cautiously abstaining from whatever may occasion any unnecessary misery in the system, is therefore, continuing the quote, the cardinal virtue of justice, which the ancients make the supreme one, unquote. This account of the good is thus the criterion of the right. What contributes to the realization of the good as so described, or at least is intended to do so, is right, and what detracts from it, or would, is wrong. This consequentialist conception of right is thus the criterion by which individual rights and wrongs are determined, and the basis for Hutcheson's argument that there are rights of necessity in extreme cases. Hutcheson puts his approach to work in two separate discussions in the system of rights of necessity. The first concerns specifically the right to lie in order to prevent a calamity to oneself or others. the kind of situation that Kant is contemplating in the case of the murderer at the door. And the second discussion offers a larger set of examples. So first, Hutcheson discusses the right to lie in extreme circumstances in System Book 2, Chapter 10, which is entitled On Obligations in the Use of Speech. In general, he says, where candor, openness, and a sincere discovery of our sentiments does not interfere with the public happiness, the immediate feelings of our heart suggest our duty and obligation, unquote, to such openness and sincerity. Ordinarily, the violation of this duty by insincerity or mendacity, quote, tends to deprive human life of all advantages from mutual confidence in conversation, unquote. Therefore, quote, whenever neither has a right, perfect or imperfect, to know our sentiments, there, even concealing them by silence, as well as any deception by signs, is criminal, unquote. Although by criminal, Hutcheson doesn't specify whether he means just morally reprehensible or even legally actionable. Hutcheson's language in all of this is clearly consequentialist. Sincerity and veracity ordinarily tend to maintain or augment the public good, and we therefore ordinarily have a duty to sincerity or veracity. However, there are circumstances in which these do not tend to the public good, and in these circumstances we therefore do not have a duty to them. In the case of war, which he considers, each side, certainly the just side if there is one, has the right to deceive the other about its intentions through speech or otherwise. Quote, another limitation or exception allowed by most authors on this subject is when promises or narrations are extorted by the avowedly unjust violence of men who in their course of life renounce all the laws of nature, unquote. In other words, one has no duty to tell the truth or to make a truthful promise to the proverbial highwayman who demands it in exchange for one's life, or to the murderer at the door who's not threatening one's life, but that of the presumably innocent intended victim who has taken refuge in one's house. Having renounced all the laws of nature, such would-be malefactors, according to Hutcheson, quote, have forfeited all these rights of mankind, the maintaining of which to them would fortify or encourage them, or give them advantages in their wicked courses, unquote. We have no obligation to do that. If anything, we have a duty not to do that. Overall, Hutcheson argues that, quote, longish quote, the general advantages of sincerity and of the mutual confidence thence arising in society are so great, and the effects of insincerity and falsehood so pernicious, that if any exceptions are allowed in cases of necessity, the necessity must be very great and manifest, that it may overbalance the evils on the other side. But in cases where we are not obliged to declare our sentiments on account of the bad conduct or intentions of some hearers, or where our refusing to answer some captious questions might discover, as much as direct speech, what the inquirers have no right to know and would abuse to the worst purposes if they knew it, there it may be lawful to use evasive answers, unquote, that is, to lie. This is just what should be expected from a consequentialist like Hutcheson. When truthful speech conduces to the public good, which is in the vast majority of cases, then it's mandatory. But in those few cases where it would not so conduce, then it's not mandatory or is actually prohibited. We will see, as we might expect, that Kant rejects such consequentialist reasoning in his discussion of the murderer at the door. The question is whether he actually needs to. We will also see that Kant explicitly rejects Hutcheson's argument from the malefactor's lack of a right to the truth. His argument from that to a right to lie. But before we turn to Kant's argument, let's look at Hutcheson's second discussion of rights of necessity. This comes in chapter 17 of book 2 of the system, which is explicitly addressed to, quote, the extraordinary rights arising from some singular necessity, unquote. Hutcheson begins by recollecting, quote, how it is that we discover the special laws of nature, unquote. The premise of the entire argument of the system, he reminds us, is that neither the general laws of morality nor any possible exceptions to them are, quote, enunciated by God in words, binding us in all cases, where God does not by words declare some exceptions, but rather, continuing, quote, that the laws of nature are inferences we make by reflecting upon our inward constitution, although of course that inward constitution is constituted by God, and, quote, by reasoning upon human affairs concerning that conduct which our hearts naturally approve as tending either to the general good or to that of individuals consistently with it, unquote. Although perhaps he would better have said tending to the good of individuals insofar as that collectively and consistently comprises the general good. That is, the general good has to, in some sense, be the good of a lot of individuals. This is the gist of Hutcheson's consequentialism. He then goes on to argue that although it might seem that, quote, there are innumerable cases in which if we only consider the immediate effect, it were better to recede from the common rule, unquote, such as the case in which, quote, a man has made an imprudent bargain of greater detriment to himself than of advantage to the other party, and yet the other party humanely insists upon it, unquote. This is the proverbial case in which a rich man insists upon repayment of his loan to a poor man, even when that will be of little marginal utility to the rich man, but would be of great marginal utility to the poor man. Such exemptions from ordinary rules, such as that debts must be repaid, should not be allowed, however, Hutcheson argues. Because, quote, the allowing liberty to recede from it in all like cases would occasion much more evil by its remote effects than the particular evils in adhering to the ordinary rule, unquote. Now, it might seem as if Hutcheson is advocating what later moralists call rule utilitarianism rather than act utilitarianism. But in my view, at least, maybe it's crude, Hutcheson has it right. A proper form of consequentialism should consider remote as well as immediate consequences of particular actions to begin with. And if the ultimate costs of an action, in this case that of allowing laxity in the repayment of debts that would undermine a generally useful social practice, would be greater than the immediate benefit, in this case to the poor man, then the exception to the general rule should not be allowed. I think this is just well-informed consequentialism, not a special kind of consequentialism. However, this argument does not apply, quote, when the whole good effects of receding from the ordinary rule, whether immediate or remote, are so great, and the evils ensuing upon our adhering to it in those rare cases so pernicious, as will in all probability overbalance all the evils to be apprehended from our counteracting the rule in this and such like rarer cases, unquote. And he concludes that the liberty of exemption from the ordinary rules in cases of necessity can be claimed, quote, only for very great public advantages or for prevention of some extraordinary calamities, unquote. He then goes on to give some examples of cases in which rights of necessity can reasonably be claimed. In a case close to but not identical to Kant's, a good man flying from a murderer can take another's horse without permission in order to escape the threat, and privately owned timber may be taken without permission to shore up a dam or dike, the failure of which would endanger a populous city or country. In such cases, Hutcheson argues, quote, the primary right of the proprietor must yield to a great necessity, unquote, but the proprietor may retain a, quote, subsidiary right to compensation of the loss that he has sustained for the sake of others, unquote. In another case, a traveler or seaman landing with a case of plague may be quarantined or even killed, even though he might otherwise recover, in order, quote, to preserve the lives of thousands, unquote. Or, to return to the duty of veracity, Hutcheson argues, a citizen might lie to a, quote, Genghis Khan or any such Eastern monster, unquote, denying that he or his fellows are sheltering an enemy of the invader when they are, in order, quote, to preserve the lives of hundreds of thousands and their innocent babes, when telling him the truth would occasion the most horrible slaughter, unquote. And again, in another case that seems to me like a variant of Kant's, if, quote, an inhuman, brutal usurper who is pursuing a just prince and his family and the bravest men, unquote, demands to know whether the latter have taken refuge in a, quote, house near the sea whence they hope presently to make their escape, unquote, the householder may outright deny that the prince is there because, quote, to hesitate or be silent on such occasion discovers the whole truth, unquote. In all of these cases, the lies may be permitted or even mandatory because only by their means can a terrible calamity or injustice be avoided, or calamity and injustice. Now, Hutcheson's series of examples thus includes the right to withhold the truth or to outright lie in extremity in a larger class of rights of necessity to make exceptions to ordinary moral laws. His allowance of such rights is a straightforward consequence of his consequentialism. They may be allowed only when they are necessary to the public or general good, not otherwise. Several points about Hutcheson's argument should be noted. First, he makes it clear that the extreme situations in which such exemptions should be allowed are rare and known to be such. Thus, he's assuming that allowing exemptions in cases of extremity will not be generalized into general laxity and thereby undermine socially useful rules or practices. That's the difference between these cases and permission for laxity in such ordinary cases as repaying debts, even when that's painful to the debtor, because there, Hutcheson assumes, laxity would undermine a useful rule or practice. Second, as Hutcheson makes explicit, in order to justify exemptions to the ordinary moral laws on the grounds of necessity in extreme cases, we, or more precisely, the agents involved in such situations, have to make judgments about the probable outcomes of their actions in the world as they find it. In his words, quote, the truth is, we must follow such probabilities as the constitution of our nature and our closest attention can suggest to us, both in settling the ordinary rules of life and determining the exceptions in some rarer cases. For it is only by our reasonings about the tendencies of actions, and these sometimes pretty remote, that we arrive at these conclusions, which we call the ordinary laws of nature, unquote. Calculation about real-world probabilities in the tendencies of actions is, of course, precisely what Kant purports to exclude from proper moral reasoning. The question is whether Kant can really successfully do that. So one last point before I turn to Kant and to that question. Hutcheson accompanies what we might call his epistemological realism about the tendencies of our actions with a suitable realism about the imputation of responsibility for the consequences of those actions. In his view, quote, the ground of all imputation of actions as virtuous and vicious is that they flow from some affection in the agent and thus are evidence of his temper and affections. You might think of Hume in this context, keeping in mind that Hume wrote the treatise several years after Hutcheson actually gave these lectures, although presumably Hume was not acquainted with them. What Hutcheson means is that people should be held responsible for what they intend, because again, of course, even with the best of intentions, actual outcomes may not be what is intended, and the underlying character of their motivation for their intentions. From this, he holds it to follow that people may be held responsible for those effects of their actions, which, having made their best efforts to accurately calculate probabilities, they could reasonably have foreseen. He says, quote, "No distant effects or consequences of actions or omissions affect their morality if they could not have been foreseen by that diligence and caution that we expect from good men, for then they are no indications of the temper of the agent," unquote. An unfortunate but unforeseeable consequence of a benevolently intended action does not prove that the agent did not have a benevolent intention, just as a beneficial but unforeseeable consequence of a malevolently intended action would not prove that the agent did not have a malevolent intention. Kant also holds that imputation should concern the intention and motivation of agents rather than the actual outcomes of actions. That's at least part of what he means by his claim that the unconditional value of a good will shines forth, even if by a special disfavor of fortune or by the niggardly provision of a stepmotherly nature, this will should wholly lack the capacity to carry out its purpose, unquote. But as we will see, Kant's argument against the right to lie, even in the attempt to protect an innocent victim from his would-be murderer, involves a different view of imputation. I think that Hutcheson's alternative account should lead us to question that part of Kant's argument also. Okay, so now I turn to Kant. Unlike Hutcheson, Kant does not include the supposed right to lie in order to save a life or more than one life under the rubric of the right to necessity. Indeed, he can refer to that supposed right in the singular because he defines it strictly as an authorization to take the life of another who is doing nothing to harm me when I am in danger of losing my own life. In other words, he limits his discussion of the right of necessity to the case of the plank of Carneades. As we saw, he denies that there's any objective moral right to take the life of another who's doing nothing to harm me when I'm in danger of losing my own. Although, because any threat of a juridical penal sanction to a person in immediate risk of drowning cannot be an effective deterrent, or so he assumes, perhaps that point could be debated, he concedes that there may be a subjective permission to do so. Perhaps, if we think of legal rights as necessarily entailing an effective deterrent, we could say that Kant allows a legal right of necessity, but no moral right of necessity in the sole case that he considers. Now, a distinction between a legal and a moral right might also help understand Kant's position about lying. As is well known, Kant founds the entire doctrine of right on the innate right to freedom due to every person in virtue of their humanity. And the connection between freedom and humanity, as I've argued elsewhere, is affected by Kant's definition of humanity in the metaphysics of morals, although actually in the doctrine of virtue, as the capacity of human beings to set their own ends, that being the essence of freedom. The innate right to freedom includes the right to do or say anything to others, as long as that, quote, does not in itself diminish what is theirs, that is, their rights, because they remain free to accept what is said to them or not. That is, the innate right to freedom includes the right to do or say anything to others as long as their freedom remains intact. This includes, quote, such things as merely communicating one's thoughts to them, telling or promise them anything, whether what one says is true and sincere or untrue and insincere, unquote. Right restricts only those of one's acts that compromise the freedom of choice and action of others. So insofar as lying does not do that, there's no call to legally restrict, let alone punish, lying as such. Although, of course, manipulation and fraud, which do use speech to compromise the freedom of others, are another matter. In this sense, Kant actually recognizes a legal right to lie, although as a general rule, not as an exception to a general rule. However, in the doctrine of virtue, Kant firmly rejects a moral permission to lie. This is not because of what one owes to others, but is rather the foremost among human beings' duty to themselves merely as human beings. Kant's argument is that lying is, quote, directly opposed to the natural purposiveness of the speaker's capacity to communicate his thoughts and is thus a renunciation by the speaker of his personality, unquote. Kant specifically says that, quote, lying in the ethical sense of the word, intentional untruth as such, need not be harmful to others in order to be repudiated. For in that case, it would be a violation of the rights of others, unquote. That is, in the case in which a lie is harmful to the rights of others, in which it does diminish what is theirs, it would be a legal violation, subject to the justifiable use of coercion, the possibility of which defines the domain of right. But it's an ethical violation no matter what, even though not legally punishable, because it is, quote, a crime of a human being against his own person and a worthlessness that must make him contemptible in his own eyes, unquote. How should we understand all of this? Kant defines duties of virtue as duties to pursue the two great ends of self-perfection and the happiness of others. Although technically he should define the broader category of ethical duties as the duty to preserve and promote self-perfection and the happiness of others, and then include in a broader category of ethical duty the narrower category of duties of virtue proper, which as strictly duties to promote the ends that are also duties, that is self-perfection and the happiness of others. The duty to oneself not to lie is actually an ethical duty to preserve one's own personality, but not a duty of virtue proper to improve it. Since then, Kant defines, in any case, apart from that, Kant then divides the duty of self-perfection into the perfection of one's natural capacities and of one's moral capacities, or man's duty to himself as an animal being and as a moral being. And he divides the latter, in turn, into the duty to perfect one's self-knowledge and conscience. There's a sentence since at the beginning of that, and since all of that, we can infer that in Kant's view, lying is in the first instance destructive of one's capacity for self-knowledge and conscience, and then that it interferes with the further development of those moral capacities. But perhaps we should also infer Kant to be saying that it interferes with the further development of one's cognitive and intellectual capacities more generally, since that depends on the possibility of truthful communication with others. As destructive of one's own capacity for self-knowledge and conscience, on which the whole possibility of one's moral agency depends, lying is the most serious violation of one's own personality, that is, capacity for morality. Being truthful with oneself is the necessary condition for being moral at all. But since legality, that is, legalitate, does not depend upon morality, moralitate in the special sense, not equivalent to morale as a whole, of one's inward disposition or motivation, only legality depends only on outward compliance with law regardless of motivation. The legal sphere does not concern itself with lying insofar as it is only injurious to one's own humanity. In that sense, one can have a legal right to lie, although again, not to defraud or manipulate, even though lying is a moral violation of the first order. Now, that's kind of condensed, I suppose, so I hope it wasn't too obscure. But all of this is, or at least should be, the background for Kant's treatment of the supposed right to lie. In fact, Kant rejects the supposed right to lie, even in the attempt to save the life of an innocent person from his pursuer at one's door for three reasons. First, it says, truthfulness in statements that one cannot avoid is a formal duty of a human being toward everyone, no matter how great the disadvantage that may arise from it for him or for someone else. And even though I admittedly do not wrong him who unjustly necessitates me to make a statement if I falsify it, That is, I do not wrong the murderer at the door. Yet, with regard to the most essential part of duty, I do wrong as such by such a falsification, Kant says. Thus, Kant accepts the traditional point that I have no obligation not to lie specifically to the would-be murderer, even if my lie would harm him, at least as he sees it, but I nevertheless have an obligation not to lie because of the damage this would do, now however, not to humanity or personality in myself, but to humanity or personality in general, or I guess extensionally to human beings in general. Kant says, thus a lie, defined merely as, take it, this should be intentionally untrue declaration toward another human being, now not, or not just to oneself, does not require the additional qualification that it must harm another. For it always harms another, if not another human being, yet humanity in general, in that it renders the source of rights unusable. Of course, one might well ask, what is it to harm humanity in general without harming any particular human beings? But I don't pursue that question here. Second, although on such grounds a lie might seem to be a moral violation, but not necessarily a legal one, Kant argues that it, quote, can be subject to sentencing as a wrong, even by external laws. That is, it can be a legal punishable crime. Quote, for if you have by a lie obstructed the deed, even of someone who is just now pursuing his murderous desires, you're legally responsible for all the consequences that may arise from your lie. But continuing, quote, if you have strictly adhered to the truth, public justice cannot touch you. Let the unforeseen consequence be what it may, unquote. That is, even if your lie itself is not a legal violation, only a moral violation, or maybe I should say their ethical violation, you can be legally liable for the consequences of your lie if they are legally punishable. So Kant continues, if you lie to the murderer at the door in your good-hearted attempt to save the intended victim whom you believe to be hiding in your house, and the murderer believes you and goes away, but unbeknownst to you, the victim has in fact left your house, suppose by a back door, and the murderer then finds and kills him. In Kant's view, you are legally responsible for his murder because your ethically insupportable lie was a necessary condition of its occurrence. We might want to say at most that in such a case you are an accessory to murder, surely liable to a less severe punishment than the murderer himself, I mean, if we want to say anything. But Kant wants to have things in black and white here. Either you're imputable for the crime or not. But if you are imputable, you are imputable for the same whole crime as the one who actually pulls the trigger. And if your lie figures in the complete explanation of the occurrence of the crime, you are imputable for it, even if you did not foresee it. Finally, Kant also argues against the possibility that there might be a, quote, intermediate principle, unquote, that could license the lie. That is, I take it a principle intermediate between the most general moral law applicable to all human actions and the specific kind of case at hand. Kant actually seems to be making a point about political representation here, namely that the wisdom or not of the legislative representatives who make our positive laws cannot free us from responsibility for always acting in accordance with the moral law. But that's, I think, a point that Alan Wood argued some time ago. But for purposes of discussion, we can take him to be making a different point. This would be the rejection of tailoring maxims to very specific, although still potentially repeatable sets of circumstances. I put it this way because we might think of a defense of rights of necessity like Hutcheson's as depending upon the possibility of tailoring our maxims to such specific circumstances. That is, Hutcheson might agree that in general moral axioms must be universalizable, while arguing as he did that precisely because of the rarity of cases of necessity, we could all adopt a maxim, for example, of lying to save innocent lives without triggering a general cascade of lying and thereby undermining the beneficial effects of truthfulness for the public good as a whole. Everyone would understand that permission to lie in such extreme but rare cases is not a general permission to lie no matter what, so the generally beneficial effects of truthfulness would not be destroyed by a generalized practice of lying. Okay, how persuasive are Kant's arguments against the supposed right to lie? I'll consider them in reverse order. First, the objection against the universalizability of an intermediate principle to lie in certain kinds of extreme cases obviously depends upon the requirement that all morally permissible maxims be universalizable, or the formula of universal law. But Kant has not explicitly based his rejection of a moral permission to lie in any case, even without harm to a would-be malefactor who has no right to demand the truth, on the formula of universal law, either in the case where he claims that such permission would injure humanity in general, or in the doctrine of virtue where he claims that it would injure one's own moral personality. I will come back to the force of Kant's claim that lying is destructive of humanity, but for the moment I just want to suggest that while Kant has good reason to reject an unrestricted maxim of lying in any circumstances, well, that would surely undermine the acceptance of statements in general, and thereby frustrate the realization of whatever end anyone might have in telling a lie, including a morally acceptable or even a morally mandatory end. It's less clear that a more tailored maxim such as "I will tell a lie only in extreme circumstances in order to save one or more innocent lives" could not be universalized. To be sure, if would-be highwaymen or murderers knew that the people whom they endanger would always lie to them, their victims might not be able to save their own lives or those of others by lying to them, because the criminals would always assume that the truth is the opposite of what their victims are saying. But if such cases are rare enough, perhaps the criminals would not know whether their victims are lying or not. Be that as it may, I think it would take a lot more than Kant actually says in the essay to prove that there could not be successfully universalizable maxims of lying only in extremis and only in order to save innocent life. Second, I think that Kant's argument about imputation is debatable. As I said, Kant seeks a clear-cut criterion for imputability. Intend to do the morally right thing, and you are not responsible for any untoward consequences of your action. Those are the faults of niggardly, stepmotherly nature, not of your goodwill. But do the wrong thing, and you are responsible for anything and everything that results. But this is harsh. We saw that Hutcheson held that people are properly imputable for the reasonably foreseeable consequences of their actions. That is, foreseeable with, quote, that diligence and caution we expect from good men, unquote. So failing to foresee untoward consequences because of failure of diligence or caution certainly does not excuse one from responsibility for them. However, human nature is imperfect, and even the most diligent and cautious agent cannot foresee everything. Hutcheson thus tempers his account of imputation by recognition of the epistemic imperfection of human beings. Individual failures of foresight may not always be excusable, but a general limitation on the demand for foresight may be. Is there any reason why Kant should not also recognize this? It's not obvious to me, at least, that there is not. After all, Kant holds that the metaphysics of morals as a whole, that is, right as well as ethics, deals with the application of the fundamental principles of morality in all their purity to, quote, the particular nature of human beings, which is cognizable only by experience, unquote. That's from the introduction to the metaphysics of morals as a whole, and as far as I'm concerned, a major premise of the whole argument. But right and ethics must recognize, both right and ethics must recognize the limitations of human nature. And actual legal systems, but also real-world ethical judgments should and typically do so as well. Kant's model of imputation might make sense in a world of epistemically perfect agents. It's less clear that it does so in a world that we actually inhabit of epistemically imperfect human beings. Finally, let's turn to Kant's claim that lying is inconsistent with the preservation of our humanity or moral personality, whether in one's own case, as in the doctrine of virtue's proscription of any lie, or that of others, or the case of others, as in the argument against the supposed right to lie. Doesn't arguing that lying is inconsistent with the preservation and promotion of humanity as an end in itself introduce a form of consequentialism into Kant's thought? To be sure, Kant's reasoning is certainly not consequentialist all the way down. To start with the requirement of universalizability, that does not ask us to consider whether the universalization of any maxim upon which we are considering acting would actually follow from our choice to act upon it. It asks us only to consider whether we could act upon our maxim if everyone also did, or so to speak, in a possible world in which everyone attempted to act on the same maxim. A thoroughgoing consequentialist perhaps would ask the former question, what are going to be the actual consequences of our attempt to act on a certain maxim? But Kant is asking the latter question, but it seems to be the question, what would be the consequences in a possible world in which everyone acted upon the proposed maxim? In other words, once we've universalized our maxim in our thought experiment, are we not asking then what would be the consequences of that universalization given what we know about actual human nature? For example, do we not make certain assumptions about actual human nature when we assume that people would simply stop accepting promises in a world in which all knew that everyone might make a promise without any intention of keeping it? That is, once we have universalized our maxim for moral, non-consequentialist reasons, isn't our further reasoning consequentialist, employing actual assumptions about human nature? Similarly, isn't our reasoning about what might or might not be destructive of humanity in our own case, or more generally, also consequentialist? That is, while our reason to care about humanity, to treat it always as an end and never merely as a means, may be thoroughly non-consequentialist, might not our subsequent reasoning about what is actually consistent with or destructive of humanity be normal, empirically based causal reasoning? Could it not be a question of fact to be decided on the basis of our empirical knowledge of human nature, whether accepting lying as permissible or even necessary in certain sorts of extreme and rare cases of danger would actually undermine our own or anyone else's capacity for moral self-knowledge and conscience? Thoroughgoing empiricist that he attempts to be, Hutcheson supposes that this is an empirical question and that the empirical answer is no. Accepting the possibility of lying in the rare cases in which only that can save an innocent life or innocent lives will not destroy our moral sense as a whole. Since Kant is actually committed to applying the admittedly a priori principle that humanity must always be treated as an end and never merely as a means to human nature as empirically known, why shouldn't he accept the same answer? Okay, thank you for your attention.